Between 1863 and 1869, two railway companies accomplished what seemed impossible, carving a path through the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountains using only hand tools, explosives, and human determination. This is the story of how America built over 1,000 miles of transcontinental railroad when the most advanced machinery available was a steam-powered shovel. The vision began in the 1850s when California was already a state but remained isolated from the rest of the nation. Traveling from New York to San Francisco meant either a dangerous 6-month wagon journey across hostile territory or an equally lengthy sea voyage around South America. People talked about a transcontinental railroad for years, but the sheer scale of the challenge kept it in the realm of fantasy. The route would need to cross the Great Plains, scale mountain ranges reaching over 7,000 feet in elevation, and traverse deserts where water was scarce and temperatures could kill a man in hours. Theodore Judah, a young engineer from Connecticut, became obsessed with finding a practical route through the Sierra Nevada, while other engineers had declared it impossible. Judah spent years surveying the mountains on foot and horseback, sometimes sleeping under the stars, eating cold meals, and pushing through terrain that had no trails. In 1860, he discovered a route following the ridgelines and valleys that could work with the right combination of grades, tunnels, and bridges. He brought his plans to Sacramento, where he convinced 4 local merchants to invest in his vision. These men, later known as the Big Four, were Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. None had any experience building railroads, but they recognized the potential fortune awaiting whoever could connect California to the east. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Nebraska, another company called the Union Pacific was preparing to build westward. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 authorized both companies to begin construction, offering government bonds and land grants for every mile of track completed. The arrangement created a race, as each company would profit based on how much territory they could claim. The Union Pacific would build west from Omaha, while the Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento. Wherever they met would mark the completion of the transcontinental line. The Central Pacific faced the mountains first. Starting in January 1863, workers began the relatively easy construction across the flat Sacramento Valley. But looming ahead were the Sierra Nevada, a granite wall that rose sharply from the California lowlands. Chief Engineer Samuel Montague and Construction Superintendent James Strobridge knew they needed an enormous workforce, but labor was scarce in California. The state's population was small, and most able-bodied men were drawn to mining, which paid better and seemed more exciting than railroad work. Charles Crocker made a controversial decision that would prove crucial to the project's success. He began hiring Chinese immigrants, many of whom had come to California during the gold rush and were now working in laundries, restaurants, and farms. The white workers initially protested, claiming the Chinese were too small and weak for such demanding labor. Crocker hired 50 Chinese workers as a test. They proved so efficient and tireless that he began recruiting more. Word spread through Chinese communities, and men arrived ready to work. Eventually, over 12,000 Chinese workers formed the backbone of the Central Pacific's labor force. These workers faced conditions that would break most people. They were paid less than white workers, receiving about $30 per month compared to 44 whites, and had to provide their own food in tents. They worked 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, in conditions ranging from summer heat exceeding 100 degrees to winter storms that buried entire camps in snow. Despite these hardships, they earned a reputation for discipline, skill, and extraordinary productivity. They didn't complain, they didn't quit, they just worked. The first major challenge came at Cape Horn, a sheer cliff face rising 1,400 feet above the American River. The route required cutting a ledge along the cliff where no foothold existed. Engineers decided the only solution was to lower workers in wicker baskets from the top of the cliff, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, swaying in the wind. These workers chiseled holes in the granite, packed them with black powder, lit the fuses, and signaled frantically to be pulled up before the explosions. Many didn't make it. Imagine being the man at the top, hauling on that rope, trying to pull your friend to safety before the blast. Sometimes you made it, sometimes you didn't. The work proceeded slowly through 1865, with workers sometimes advancing only inches per day. But eventually, a narrow shelf emerged from the cliff face, wide enough for railroad tracks. As the railroad climbed higher into the Sierra, the workers encountered solid granite that needed to be removed. The route required 15 tunnels through the mountains, and the longest, the Summit Tunnel, needed to bore 1,659 feet through pure granite at an elevation of 7,000 feet. Work began on the Summit Tunnel in August 1865, from both ends simultaneously. To speed progress, workers also sank a shaft from the top of the mountain, allowing for faces to be worked at once. The tunnel work was brutal beyond description. Workers used hand drills to pound holes into the granite, often working in teams where one man held the drill while others struck it with sledgehammers. Each hole took hours to complete. Your hands went numb from the vibration. Your ears rang from the constant hammering in the confined space. Your lungs filled with rock dust that you coughed up for hours afterward. Once a series of holes was finished, workers packed them with black powder, cleared the tunnel, and set off the blast. After the smoke cleared, they returned to remove the shattered rock by hand, loading it into carts that were pushed or pulled outside. On a good day, they might advance 8 inches. The granite was so hard that progress sometimes slowed to just a few inches per day. Nitroglycerin offered a potential solution. This powerful liquid explosive had recently been developed, but was extremely unstable and dangerous. A Scottish chemist named James Howden arrived at the railroad in 1866 with a formula for manufacturing nitroglycerin on site. The results were dramatic. Nitroglycerin was 7 times more powerful than black powder, and tunneling speeds doubled. But the cost was measured in lives. The explosive could detonate from a sharp impact, a sudden temperature change, or sometimes for no apparent reason at all. Men simply vanished in blinding flashes. Their bodies, or what remained of them, were carried out in pieces. Several workers were killed in accidental explosions before the railroad eventually stopped using it in the tunnels. Winter brought a different kind of enemy. The Sierra Nevada received enormous snowfall, sometimes 40 feet in a single season. Avalanches roared down the mountainsides without warning, burying work camps and entombing workers in snow. In one incident, an entire camp of 20 workers disappeared under a massive slide. Rescuers dug frantically, but the snow was too deep, too heavy, too vast. Their bodies weren't recovered until the following spring, when the snow finally melted. The railroad tried building wooden snow sheds over sections of track, but construction had to continue, regardless of weather. Workers lived and labored beneath the snow, creating a network of tunnels through drifts that towered overhead. Some camps remained buried for months, with workers accessing them through snow tunnels and living in perpetual twilight. They rarely saw the sun. They lost track of days. Some men went a little mad from the darkness and isolation. The Union Pacific building westward from Omaha faced different challenges. The Great Plains offered relatively flat terrain, but the region was vast, and every supply had to be shipped from eastern factories. Rails, spikes, locomotives, tools, food, and equipment traveled by riverboat and then by the railroad itself as it extended westward. The logistics were staggering. Building a mile of track required 40 rail cars full of materials. Everything was assembled in a precise sequence. First came the grading crews who shaped the roadbed. Then came the tie placers, who positioned wooden ties every few feet. Rail handlers carried iron rails, each weighing over 500 pounds, and positioned them on the ties. It took 5 men per rail, straining together, backs burning. Spike drivers followed, hammering spikes to secure the rails. Finally, a work train rolled forward onto the newly laid track, and the process repeated. The Union Pacific also faced challenges the Central Pacific didn't. The Plains tribes recognized that the railroad threatened their way of life. The Iron Road brought settlers, hunters, and soldiers. It disrupted buffalo migration routes and divided tribal territories. Armed resistance occurred regularly. Work crews often labored with rifles stacked nearby, and military escorts accompanied surveying parties. Men died on both sides. The situation created a tense and often violent environment, though both sides recognized that the railroad's progress was ultimately unstoppable. The Union Pacific's workforce was as diverse as the Central Pacific's, though different in composition. Irish immigrants formed the largest group, many having fled famine in their homeland and then served in the Civil War. Veterans from both Union and Confederate armies worked side by side, former enemies now united in common labor. There were also freed slaves, Mexican laborers, and men from virtually every European nation. The work camps were rough places, filled with gambling, drinking, and occasional violence. Mobile towns called Hell on Wheels followed the railroad, offering entertainment and vice to workers who had little else to spend their wages on. Crossing rivers presented engineering challenges for both companies. The Central Pacific had to bridge numerous gorges and canyons in the Sierra. Workers constructed wooden trestle bridges, some rising over 100 feet above ravines, standing on scaffolding that swayed in the wind. Hammering beams together while looking down at certain death required nerves most men didn't have. These temporary structures allowed construction to continue while more permanent stone bridges were built. The Union Pacific faced similar challenges, crossing the many rivers of the plains and the steep canyons of Wyoming. The most impressive was the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming, a spindly wooden structure that spanned 650 feet and rose 130 feet above the creek below. Passengers often closed their eyes when trains crossed it, convinced the structure would collapse. It looked like a strong wind could knock it down. Both railroads struggled with the sheer remoteness of their work. The Central Pacific established a supply line that stretched back to Sacramento. But as construction moved deeper into the mountains and then across Nevada, maintaining that supply chain became increasingly difficult. Locomotives and equipment broke down in the harsh conditions, and replacement parts took weeks to arrive. Workers sometimes went without adequate food or fresh water. Men got sick, they got weak. The Union Pacific faced similar issues building across Nebraska and Wyoming. Water was particularly scarce on the high plains, and the company had to drill wells or haul water by rail to construction camps. Imagine working in 100-degree heat, swinging a sledgehammer all day, and being told to ration your water. Disease was a constant threat. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery swept through camps where sanitation was primitive and medical care almost non-existent. Men would be fine one day and dead 3 days later. Injuries from the dangerous work were common. Explosions, rockfalls, runaway carts, and accidents with tools and equipment killed or maimed workers regularly. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, and no liability for companies. A worker injured too badly to continue was simply dismissed and left to fend for himself. If you couldn't work, you were useless to the railroad. By 1868, the Central Pacific had finally emerged from the Sierra Nevada and was racing across the relatively flat terrain of Nevada. Construction accelerated dramatically. The company laid over 350 miles of track in 1868 alone. The Chinese workers, now experienced and efficient, achieved remarkable feats of productivity. On one occasion, they laid 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that stood for decades. From sunrise to sunset, they moved like a machine, every man knowing his job, every movement practiced and precise. Each rail had to be positioned precisely, every spike driven, every bolt tightened. Yet they maintained both speed and quality. The Union Pacific was also accelerating. Pushing through Wyoming and into Utah, the two companies could now see the end approaching. But the Pacific Railroad Act hadn't specified where they should meet. This oversight created an absurd situation where both companies kept building past each other, sometimes with grading crews working on parallel roadbeds just a few hundred feet apart. They could literally see each other working. Each company wanted to claim as much mileage as possible since government subsidies were paid per mile. Finally, Congress intervened and designated Promontory Summit in Utah as the meeting point. On May 10, 1869, officials from both companies gathered at Promontory Summit for the ceremony that would mark the railroad's completion. A golden spike was prepared for the occasion. Along with spikes of silver and gold and silver alloy sent by various states, telegraph wires were connected to the ceremonial spike and to the sledgehammer that would drive it, so the entire nation could hear the blows that completed the Transcontinental Railroad. Leland Stanford of the Central Pacific and Thomas Durant of the Union Pacific took turns with the hammer. Both famously missed the spike on their first swings, but the telegraph operator sent the signal anyway. Across America, bells rang, cannons fired, and celebrations erupted. People poured into the streets. Strangers embraced. The impossible had been done. The ceremony was grand, but it obscured the reality of who actually built the railroad. The Chinese workers who had performed the most dangerous and difficult work on the Central Pacific were not included in the official photographs or given recognition in the speeches. They stood at the edges, watching men in fine suits take credit for their sweat and blood. The Irish, Mormon, and other laborers of the Union Pacific were similarly overlooked. The completion celebration focused on the executives, engineers, and financiers, while the workers who had actually carved the railroad through mountains and across deserts were already moving on to the next job, carrying their tools and their memories. The human cost of the Transcontinental Railroad remains difficult to calculate precisely. The Central Pacific never kept careful records of worker deaths, and estimates vary widely. Some historians suggest over 1,000 Chinese workers died during construction, though the true number could be higher. Many bodies were never reported. Many deaths were never reported. The Union Pacific also lost hundreds of workers to accidents, disease, and violence. These men were buried in unmarked graves along the route, their sacrifices largely forgotten. Nobody recorded their names. Nobody wrote to their families. The engineering achievement, however, was undeniable. The railroad cut travel time from New York to San Francisco from 6 months to less than a week. It cost about $60 million to build, an enormous sum at the time, but it transformed the American economy. Goods could now move across the continent in days. Agriculture expanded as farmers could ship their products to distant markets. Mining boomed as ore could be transported efficiently. Immigration increased as people could reach the West Coast quickly and safely. The isolated territories of the West began developing into states. The railroad literally tied the nation together. The techniques developed during construction became standard practice for future engineering projects. The use of large, diverse labor forces working in specialized teams became the model for massive infrastructure projects. The logistical systems developed to supply remote construction. Sites influenced everything from military operations to future railroad construction. The experience gained cutting tunnels through Sierra granite proved valuable when engineers faced similar challenges in other mountain ranges. Every major project that came after drew lessons from this one. The environmental impact was also significant. The railroad disrupted wildlife migration patterns and made possible the near extinction of the American bison. Forests were cleared for ties and bridges. The landscape was permanently altered by cuts, fills, and tunnels. Native American populations, already under pressure from Western expansion, found their lands further divided and their traditional ways of life increasingly impossible to maintain. The world they knew was ending, and the railroad was the instrument of that ending. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad inspired similar projects across the globe. Other nations looked at what America had accomplished and began planning their own ambitious rail networks. The Canadian Pacific Railway, the Trans-Siberian Railway, and numerous other transcontinental projects followed, each facing their own unique challenges but drawing lessons from the American experience. If it could be done here, it could be done anywhere. The technology used to build the railroad was remarkably primitive by modern standards. There were no bulldozers, no pneumatic drills, no dynamite in the early years, no electric lights, no power tools of any kind. The heaviest equipment was steam-powered shovels and locomotives, but most of the actual construction was done by men with hammers, picks, shovels, and wheelbarrows. Men with calloused hands and bent backs. Men who couldn't read or write, but could split granite with precision. The fact that they completed such a massive project with such limited technology makes the achievement even more remarkable. The Transcontinental Railroad stands as testament to human determination and ingenuity. Thousands of workers, most of them immigrants, seeking a better life in America, accomplished what many considered impossible. They carved a path through granite mountains, crossed burning deserts, and spanned vast plains using little more than hand tools and determination. The railroad they built transformed a nation, connected a continent, and demonstrated that even the most daunting challenges could be overcome through vision, hard work, and the willingness to push beyond what seemed possible. Their legacy is written not just in the iron rails that still cross those mountains, but in the very shape of modern America itself.